Hello and welcome to Yachting Yarns. I'd like to thank all the people out there all around the world who are downloading the podcast and enjoying all these stories. Now, this episode has something extra special. There is video to go with the interview, so you can enjoy pictures along with our discussion. Tonight, I'm talking with Sue Mason. Now, Sue and her husband Brian spent many, many years in charge of super yachts in North Queensland. Her clientele were wealthy visitors from overseas who ended up having some very unique adventures. They also ended up being very heavily involved with the Kennedy family in America. But let's go back to the very beginning. You have a very interesting story. You grew up around engines.
Yes, electrical, actually, and generators and welders was one of my specialties. Dad had an electrical contracting business and, I used to help sort out the vans on a Saturday, clean up the tradies' vans in the back and sort out all the spare parts and stuff like that. So I sort of was introduced to electrical goods, more commercial electrical goods, not so much, TV sets and appliances. It was all the commercial side of things from a very young age. But I started working for Dad when I was more or less left school, so in the late teens. For 18 years I worked for him before I actually went full-time to sea.
Have you always loved the sea?
I never really got introduced to it until I was in my 20s, because even though I lived in North Queensland and the Great Barrier Reef was on our doorstep, it wasn't something that was introduced to us in our education schemes. I mean, scuba diving and things like that, never knew anything about it. I knew about shipping because my father's father was a foreign-going master, shipping captain. So he was on ships all his life, and he was actually a harbour master along the Queensland coast and a pilot during the Second World War. And so shipping was in our family, but because Dad got chronically seasick, he never went to sea. So it never kept going through his generation. It skipped his generation, and I, by pure accident, really got into it through the marine generator side of things, because I was dealing with Onan gensets up in North Queensland and troubleshooting them, fixing them. We were the agents for them. And so all the boats, especially the game fishing boats coming over from America, they all had Onan generators on them. So Onan became a very big marine generator for the marine industry in North Queensland through the 70s, 80s and 90s, when the marlin season was huge, and then the charter boats started to come up and the diving industry started in North Queensland. And once the international airport was built in Cairns in the late 80s, the place just took off. So it was sort of something that wasn't really known to us normally as children, but as an adult, I took to it like a duck to water, really. Never got seasick, ever.
Like a duck to water. Then that's interesting, because North Queensland is very popular amongst American big game fishermen, isn't it?
Well, it was. It's sort of probably not so now. In the heyday of 70s, 80s and 90s, it was a massive industry, and all of the rich and famous Americans used to come out, and there was mother boats and there was game fishing boats, and then it's evolved into most of the game fishing boats now can cater for the anglers on board, so you don't get so much of the mother shipping that we did. It's fallen off greatly because it's like game shooting, game in Africa and things like that is sort of not trendy anymore. It's not something the younger generation take on. It's sort of frowned upon. And so too with the game fishing. You can't even weigh a marlin up and down the Queensland coast anymore. There's no weigh stations like there was, throughout the 90s and everything. So it has faded off considerably.
That's interesting, because how much would a large marlin weigh?
1,000 pound or more is how they used to gauge them. So the big ones were, up to 1,400 pound, and it was always in pound because it was the Americans that were catching them. So it was never you could do it in kg, but all of the major big marlin were all female and all over 1,000 pound.
What do you do with 1,000 pound marlin after you've caught it? I mean, you can't exactly have it for lunch.
They don't even eat them at all because of the high mercury content. So in the very early days when they were first catching them, they would take the carcass to the local taxidermist and he would make a mould out of them. And then after a while, they had so many moulds, they didn't even need to keep the fish anymore. They used to just dump it, actually, which sounds horrible, but it was always hanging behind the mothership. And the sharks would come in and eat it. And you'd have a few hundred sharks nibbling on a 1,000-pound marlin right behind the boat, and it would take literally seconds for it to be demolished completely.
Wow, pretty scary stuff. You've got some very unique skills, which mean that as you travel around the world, everybody would want to be your best friend.
Oh, one would hope so, especially the rich owners that own the big boats, we hope.
Because you do have some unique skills, don't you, that most captains don't have?
Well, that's right. Well, I think the blend of electrical, mechanical, and having our actual marine engineering tickets, quite large ones actually, from the UK, captain's tickets. My husband's got a 3,000-ton captain license, and both of us have got Y3 engineering, which is 3,000 kilowatts unlimited, which means you can go around the world anywhere. There's no international limitations to where we can travel with those tickets. So they are very big tickets for a team, like husband and wife team, and particularly a female. I've never done a course with another female in the room. So all the courses we ever did over the years, I was the only female, especially the engineering course.
And, of course, talking about your husband, you didn't meet him under glamorous circumstances, did you?
No, it was over an Onan generator, 12.0 MDJF Onan generator that he had on a boat. It was a liveaboard charter boat up in Cairns. He joined it in the late 70s, but it happened to have an Onan generator on it, and it was under warranty, and we didn't actually do the installation. The installation was done by another company, but they did the wrong thing and flooded it, and so we got called in as the under warranty agents, and that's where we met, and there you are, sort of, love happened over the top of an MDJF Onan generator.
So I have an image of you, this is not a very good rom-com, I have an image of you in like overalls covered in grease down in a dark, smelly room, and you look across the room and you meet. Am I close?
Fortunately, the engine rooms were all very, very clean because they're not on trawlers as such or dirty old fishing boats. They're on nice, 5-star charter boats. So fortunately, it's not exactly that situation. But I have been in overalls and I have been greasy, yes.
The life you've had is pretty amazing. From 1993, you spent 15 years just on the one boat. Was it a big 190-footer?
Yes, it was a 90-footer, and it was on the Queensland coast. We also did New Guinea and the Solomons. We did the Whitsundays. We did seasons with that one. She was initially built as a mothership for the Marlin season, and then she was basically marketed to an elite group of business people, more or less, and also real estate, corporate type functions and prize-winning groups in the Whitsundays, and then we did our own charter. We had our own charter clientele, so they would charter us during the Marlin season, during our trips to New Guinea and the Solomons, and so we basically worked almost 300 or plus days at sea every year, particularly towards the end. We were just so flat out with that boat. We also did Sydney Harbour cocktail cruises a couple of times. We did a big trip down the Queensland coast, doing prize-winning trips all the way through through the Whitsundays, through Brisbane, through the Gold Coast, Newcastle, and then down into Sydney in 1993. The last time we did a cocktail season in Sydney was 1993. So the charter industry grew and grew and grew through the sort of trips we were doing. It was quite unique, actually, with all the trips we were doing. And it was a high-end charter boat, so it attracted really nice clientele.
So what would a typical charter be like? Like, how long would you go away for?
Usually, well, the ones in the Whitsundays were 3 nights, 4 days, and they were prize-winning type trips, and you just do the Whitsundays and go into the bays and do bushwalking and swimming and snorkelling and things like that. And on the reef, you could do 7 to 10 days on the reef easily between Cairns and Lizard Island, diving. That was mainly diving or fishing. We did a lot of fishing. We did a lot of spear fishing, snorkelling, diving. My husband Brian was a dive instructor, and so he would lead the groups, and one of our deckhands would always be dive master and be coming in the rear end of the groups to keep an eye on all the divers. And because I had the captain's ticket, I'd remain on board and cover the captain side of it with the regulations for dive charter boats in Australia. The really interesting trips were New Guinea and the Solomons, where you've got the culture, you've got history, you've got World War II, you've got diversity like you can't believe up there. There's the largest coral lagoon in the world, which is the Morovo Lagoon, which is extremely interesting. There's the Vonnevonnen Lagoon, and there's some lovely little resorts like Upi Island Resort and Lola Island Resort, and other places have opened up there, probably a little bit compromised at the moment after COVID, but there's so many lovely little traditionally sort of built resorts for people that want to come up there and dive and fish and explore. But because we were a roving charter boat, we could explore and travel through all of those areas. And we'd usually try and do a week. We'd start at Gizo and go down to all the way down through the islands, through the Western Province and to Segei, and there was an airport there so they could fly out, and then you'd do the next trip from Segei and go all the way back up to Gizo. And you could easily spend a week, if not more, exploring all of the places in between, and just the diversity over there and the calm waters. You always had calm on Blackett Strait, and so you had this sort of area that you could cruise without going out in the open ocean. It was just beautiful, absolutely stunning cruising through there.
And of course, you'll be going to places that people wouldn't normally get a chance to go to because you would be able to duck in there from the ocean. So that must have been an interesting experience for your guests.
That's right, exactly. Because there's no cars or there's no streets, if you know what I mean. Most of the islands around the Munda area, there's definitely roads and cars, but in the villages and the remote villages, there's no cars. So the only way to get there is either by dugout canoe or charter boat like us, or a tender or a dinghy. So it's all water-related activities because of the lack of infrastructure up there.
That must be an interesting sight, this 90-foot boat coming into a tiny little village.
Oh, yeah. The first year was really interesting. At first, you get a little bit of jealousy and suspicion, and it takes a while for the elders to sort of get used to you. So Brian's really good at going ashore, finding out who the head of the village is, talking to them, sitting down with them, explaining who we are. And we did a lot of goodwill up there. So over the years, the goodwill became a really big part of the trip, where we would actually collect, or have friends in Cairns collect items for us all year round, and then we'd pack the boat up totally to the hilt and take it over. We gave it directly to the people. We didn't take it into the cities like Honiara and give it to a charity to distribute. We did it ourselves. So we actually physically did it ourselves.
Yeah, very wise.
The island people. Yeah, we did medical. I used to do all the medical work on board the boat on the back deck. We'd do a clinic day, and our guests would suss out people in the village that had a tropical ulcer, or a cut or a slash, and it easily gets infected up there with the warmer water and the bugs in the water. So you were forever treating people with really quite serious looking wounds, and it was very rewarding. And I guess most of them were doctors, pharmacists, dentists. It was just natural for them to see somebody injured and bring them back to have some clinical work done on board the boat. And I had amazing medical equipment. We got the Royal Flying Doctor used to supply us with a lot of medical antibiotics and dressings and antiseptics and things like that. So we were very well equipped to run the on-board clinics.
That must have been an amazing story for them to go back and say, I took this wonderful cruise and I ended up running a clinic on an island.
Yeah, exactly. It was, it was really amazing. And to go back to the village and see the people all fixed up, they'd be all walking around normally, no infections, no tropical ulcers and stuff like that. It was great. Good to follow up on them. And
also nice that you ended up being part of their community.
Yes. Well, in the end, in the last year we were up there, which was 1999, we did go back up in 2000, but they'd had a coup in Fiji and a coup in Honiara, and so we were basically hunted out of the place really quickly because it was getting very ugly very quickly. So we actually transferred over to New Guinea and did our season that year, year 2000, in Kimby Bay in New Britain. We based ourselves there at the Walindi Resort and worked out of Kimby Bay for that year. By the year 2000, the boat was just an integral part of the community in the Solomons. And on our way through New Guinea, we used to do a lot of humanitarian aid throughout as we transferred through. So it became, just a staple until we had to leave, which was really a shame.
That's not something you would have been expecting, though. You would have just gone up there from a point of view of simply having a cruisy lifestyle. And that must have been quite a shock that you found yourself suddenly becoming more of a humanitarian ship than just a luxury cruise yacht.
Well, it was our own doing, though, insofar as the ability to have the boat accommodate all of the goodwill. And this was fishing gear, educational gear, clothing. We ended up taking push bikes. We took, water containers. There was just so much. Each year you found more and more and more need or more ability to supply because we had the vehicle to do it. And we didn't have guests on board when we transited from Cairns through New Guinea to the Solomons. It was just crew on board. So we could stack the boat to the ceiling in all the rooms and the salon. I mean, it was full, absolutely. And the last year it was so full. Then we had big storage containers right up on the flybridge roof. And when we did have guests on board, those containers were full, and we would encourage the guests to help distribute the clothing and the various needs to the villages as we went around. So they became part of it as well. And we'd encourage them to bring with them on the groups secondhand clothing to give away rather than bringing a suitcase full of they could wear the clothes while they were on board, but prepare to give it away at the end of the trip. So it was sort of replenish. And we also used to blow up balloons and put balloons out for the kids, and we became known as the balloon boat in the end. It was really an amazing experience for all the kids. They'd come out in the dugout canoes, they'd be screaming and yelling, and they'd just have, it was just wonderful to see. It was great. As you cruise through the areas, it was lovely.
Well, it's a wonderful thing that you did, and I'm sure they remember you guys coming up there. I'm sure they have fond memories and tales of these people from overseas just landing there and helping them.
Well, they do, because we went back in our own boat, our own sailing yacht in 2019 after spending 20 years away overseas when we were working on the big super yachts around the world. But we went back in our own boat, and for the simple reason it's to revisit all the areas that we used to frequent in the 1990s. And we came into Tubi Island in New Guinea, and that was one of the islands we did a lot of humanitarian work and built up the school and supplied uniforms and books and educational needs and everything to the little boarding school that was on that island and still is on that island. And we came into one of the bays and anchored up, and this dugout canoe came out to the side of the boat, and Brian looked down and said, "Oh, do you happen to remember Captain Brian?" And he just big smile on his face, and he remembered Brian straight away. And he took us around to the school, and he went ashore and told everybody at the school that we were here. And it turns out that the teachers at that school were kids when we were there 20 years ago. So there's like 4 or 5 teachers at the school, and they were all little kids when we used to go there. And they remembered us. They put on a big concert day for us and had a big public holiday for the whole school. It was incredible, actually, to go back and see it all.
It sounds wonderful. Were you the only people doing that? Is that a uniquely thing that you were doing?
Yes, there was one dive charter boat working out of Honiara in those years, but it wasn't the same quality of boat. Ours was unique in so far it was 5-star, and the clientele that we had on board were upmarket, not upmarket people. I wouldn't say they weren't snobby by any means. They loved diving, they loved fishing, they loved the adventures, and they certainly really got involved in all of the humanitarian stuff. And it was unique, yes. We were the only ones. And it really came from 1993 when we first did our first trip to New Guinea, and we didn't take any humanitarian anything with us. We just, did our usual thing. It was just an exploratory trip that we did. We had 3 or 4 client groups that we took up there that we thought would get a lot out of it, which they did. But by the end of it, we were giving them the shirts off our own backs because of the desperation of these people. They weren't desperate in, it's hard to explain. Like, they basically had their church clothing for a Sunday and one other set of clothing for the rest of the week. But, they didn't know any different. We knew different, and that's why we felt the need to give them what we could. They're just in islands, like in the Engineer group of New Guinea, in the Louisiade archipelago. They're just outer islands that absolutely get no support whatsoever. There's no supermarkets close by. Their means of transport is a dugout canoe, as I mentioned before, or maybe nowadays they tend to have more fiberglass longboats with an outboard motor, and, maybe somebody in the village has got one of them. But to get to anywhere that has clothing or food is miles and miles and miles away. So they're all subsistence. They live on fish. They live on whatever they can grow in the garden, yams and things like that. So whatever they can be given extra is a bonus. And a lot of the sailing boat cruises, some of them do a group of sailing boats and they'll organise a rally. And those type of cruises tend to take goodwill, but not in the quantities we could take on the big charter boat, that's for sure.
So you were kind of doing the opposite. Most boats that come into harbour come in so they can get stuff, pack up their boat from locally. You're doing the opposite. You're coming into harbour and unloading your boat.
Yes, basically we were, and doing it also throughout the whole trip. Like the major lots of offloading was on our way, transiting from A to B and going through the various villages, and then, continuing that trend on as much as we could while we had guests on board. And we had the room to do it. We had plenty of storage, so it didn't impede on the guests so far as in their cabins and things like that.
So if you had all these medical people who were guests on your boat and they pulled in, they did a yacht, was that what they talked about at night over dinner? Did they chat about what they'd done that day and the locals, how they'd helped the locals? Was that the conversation?
Yes, it could be, yeah, because most of the time the locals would also be catching as crabs, and they'd go off at night and they'd take some of their guests with them while they went and caught crabs in the mangroves, and or they'd come on deck and they'd try and sell us carvings, or we included the locals everywhere we went. So even though you might have a time where you're inside having dinner and you wouldn't have locals, as soon as dinner was finished, the locals would be sitting in their dugouts behind the boat, fishing, and, the guests would invite them on board and they'd sit and they'd either fish with them or talk to them, or they might have a little sing-song happening, or, there's just, we did auctions. We'd invite them on board to bring their carvings, and then we'd have a big auction, and then the proceeds of the auction would be given to the village, and we did all sorts of things like that. It was quite amazing. Actually.
You obviously hadn't planned that when you first started doing your cruise. It's a wonderful adventure. It's a wonderful, wonderful adventure from someone from overseas to have. You'd really go home thinking that you'd seen something that you were never going to see again.
That's right, and it was all totally impromptu. Nothing was planned. I mean, it evolved over time, actually, and the guests just really loved the interaction. They really did.
Wonderful. So you did that for about 7 or 8 years.
Up in New Guinea and the Solomons, yes, we did. That's right. And as I said, the only reason it stopped was because of the tensions in the South Pacific from year 2000, and it didn't settle down, so we couldn't really go back up there for some years, and then the boat we were on got leased to a surfing company, and it was actually ended up in Indonesia as a surfing charter boat. And we didn't want to join it or do that sort of work up in Indonesia, so we left and went overseas, which was a shame.
I have to ask you about two very important people you met in the Solomons, a couple of locals who saved JFK and his fellow crewmen who were stranded on a tiny island when their PT boat sank. Did you know about that story before you went up there?
Not before we went to the Solomons. We found out about it, the history. We knew about the World War II history in the Coral Sea and PNG and the Solomons, but you never know all of it or to what extent or individual stories until you actually get up there and tour around and spend time in the locations, and having the boat up there allowed us to do that, because you're roaming around and, you're picking up individuals' stories as you're going through the villages and meeting the people. They were the first responders. They were the two natives that came across Kennedy and another one of his men who used to swim from Olasana Island to this tiny little island, which is now called Kennedy Island. There was some wreckage there. There was some wreckage there on that island, and the two natives had come over to check out the wreckage, and they came upon Kennedy and his mate. They weren't injured and they were strong, and they used to swim all the time out to this island to try and flag other PT boats down or patrol boats to tell them that there was 11 men alive. A couple of guys died in the explosion of the PT 109, but the rest of them survived, and Kennedy in fact swam with one of them on his back to Olasana Island. So those guys were alive on the island and then sort of hiding under coconut trees and stuff on that island. But every night, Kennedy and this other guy would swim to try and attract attention to get them saved. But the two natives came upon them. That was Buko and Aroni. And Buko climbed a coconut tree and got a coconut down and somehow explained to Kennedy in pidgin English or however to scratch a note on the skin of the coconut. And Aroni and Buko then paddled to the Coast Watch guy who was on a radio station on Columbangra Island, and he was the one that called the PT base on Rendover Island to say, these two natives know where these 11 guys are. And then Bucco and Aroni, they paddled their boat to the PT base at Rendover Island, which is a long, long way to paddle. And then they jumped on a PT boat and came around and took the PT boat to Olasana Island where Kennedy and his men were and rescued them.
And changed history.
Because
those guys wouldn't have survived, would they?
No. There's nothing to eat. I mean, nothing. No drinking water, nothing. You know, there's no fresh water on Olasana, and it's just a coral sort of cay in the middle of Blackett Strait.
So it had been a slow, horrible death?
Yeah. And Kennedy was strong, and he used to swim, and he'd go and, sort of swim around trying to, attract attention. So he's definitely a hero. There's no two ways about it. But those two guys were integral in his rescue, but they never got invited to his inauguration in America, in Washington, because the English decided they didn't speak good enough. They couldn't sort of converse. So they weren't sent over to the inauguration. The English sent somebody from Honiara, apparently, and Kennedy just took one look at it and said, "You're not the natives that rescued me." So, it wasn't really the rightful thing to do.
Now, in researching this, I did discover that inscribed coconut actually sat on his desk for most of the time he was in Parliament, including when he was president.
Yes, exactly. And it remains in the JFK Library in Boston, Massachusetts, and we've actually been there and seen it and taken a photo of it.
Oh, how lovely.
That whole story led us to do the full 360 of the Kennedy family in a way, because we got to know Bucco Gasser very well in the Solomons. He lived on an island in the Bonabonna Lagoon, and we actually got to meet him personally, talk to him. We ended up getting a film crew up to his island to interview him and do a little bit of a documentary to hand to the Kennedy family, because his main complaint was, even though they were the first responders to JFK and his crew when they got wrecked on the PT-109 in the Solomons, they never really got any recognition out of the family. And all he wanted was to live his last days out in a normal house with a normal toilet, a normal kitchen and a normal shower. And that's all he wanted, really. He had his grass hut and it had no facilities in it whatsoever, and he was getting old and he just wanted the comforts of the home. So we sort of made a promise to him that we would help him out with that wish. So we did this little documentary, and a friend of ours knew a lady in America that worked for the Kennedys, Melody Miller. We were able to get in contact with her directly, and Melody took the documentary and showed it to the Kennedy family, and they raised some funds towards getting this house built for Bucco. And we managed the funding through one of our super yacht owners, who was an investment guy in Michigan, and he got hold of the money, and then Brian and I personally put the balance in. We got our friend who owns the resort on Lola Island to get hold of the builder and build the house and, make sure the money went to the builder and, all that sort of stuff. So that the financing of this funding was very well managed, and we ended up building Bucco his home on his island. We couldn't do it for the other guy, Aroni, who lived on another island further north, because we never really knew him personally and we couldn't get access to him. But we did build Bucco his home. But then when we went to America to run super yachts in the 2000s, we ended up getting to meet Melody Miller in Washington. She gave us a tour of the Senate offices and the Congress and, the Capitol Hill and everything. We got a personal tour by Melody. We ended up at the Boston Library and Museum seeing the coconut that Bucco got Kennedy to inscribe, these men are alive, and that's all still there. The flags, dugout canoes and the paddles and all the memorabilia from the Solomon Islands was all in Kennedy's Senate office. And we were able to sort of put the whole story together more by chance because, we'd been in the Solomon Islands, we'd done all that humanitarian work, and then we went to United States to work on yachts there, and travelling on yachts gave us the privilege of being able to go to Washington and meet these people that, helped get this wish together. So it was pretty amazing.
There's a photograph of you and Brian with a very strange, I have to say strange, head of JFK. What's that about?
That is the bust of JFK that the Kennedys had made for the two heroes, Aroni and Bucco. They actually got it made, and we were able to personally present the first one to Bucco while he was still alive on his island, and that was back in the early 2000s, probably about 2003, I believe.
Yeah.
And then Aroni's bust was sent over, and a friend of ours happened to be going to the Solomons on his boat, and he was able to present that bust to Aroni on his island, which is quite a long way away from where Bucco's island is. So they both ended up with a bust of Kennedy in the end as memorabilia to keep forever. And the family still have it. We were there at the island, not Bucco's island anymore because the mother has been shifted to her family's island, and she and the family have the bust there.
What a lovely memento.
Yeah.
Precious.
So it is precious. Better than photos because at least it'll last forever.
Yes.
Photos get lost, you know. So.
Yes. Yeah, it's a great story. So you and Brian had a really interesting 19 years, not knowing what was going to happen when you started out. And then you took off for Florida. And once again, you didn't know what was going to happen, but you had a lot of adventures over there, didn't you? Miami, Cuba.
Yes, we did. When we took off for America, yes, we definitely had probably more than we bargained for. Originally, we took off thinking we'd go for 6 months maximum, and 20 years later, we returned. So we did, the east coast of America, we did the Great Lakes, we did the Bahamas, we did Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, we did Miami, obviously, we did the Caribbean, which included Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, down to St. Martin. Eventually we did Jamaica and all the western coast of Caribbean, all down to Panama, Bocas del Toro and those regions. And then that boat got shipped to the Pacific. And then we came back over to the Pacific ourselves. So 20 years.
For a good 20 years. I think that's a good topic for our next podcast. So I want to thank you for your time for this one. And we're going to hear all about Cuba and Miami and Jamaica and all the rest of it in the next one. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Linda. Pleasure.
And that's all for this episode. I hope you can join me for the next episode to hear all about Sue and Brian's American adventure. Thanks for listening. I'm Linda Woods. Bye for now. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you can support my work at Buy Me a Coffee. Go to Buy Me a Coffee and click onto Yachting Yarns.